Australia is facing a housing crisis with soaring rents and 10,000 people becoming homeless each month. The question remains, how can housing become affordable once again? Joining me today is Martin Kennedy, Group Executive Manager of Public Affairs at Home in Place. It's wonderful to have you with us. Why has leaving housing to the private sector been a failure in your eyes? Take us through a bit.
Well, look, I think a lot of people probably aren't aware, but back in the day, around 15 to 20% of all new housing was actually built by the government. I mean, it sounds like a radical idea in 2025, but it really isn't. This is just something that had bipartisan support for decades, really. Both sides of politics were into it. They actually used to almost compete with each other to see, who could build the most. And as recently as the 1990s, they were still building 10% of all new homes, and it's gone off a cliff after that. And these days, they build almost none. So, we're talking about maybe 1%, 2% in a good year. We've moved to this completely private sector-led delivery model. We've been running that for 30 odd years. And, I think as we can see on the news every night, the results have been a complete disaster. You've had house prices that have increased many, many times faster than wages. Rents have gone through the roof, particularly in the last 5 years since the pandemic. Social housing has been rationed to the most desperate cases. And you put all of that together, and what you've got is a situation where people with full-time jobs, including frontline emergency services workers, are staring down the barrel of homelessness. And if that's not, the definition of failure, then I don't really know what is.
Yeah, alarming to say the least. Can you explain the 1 in 10 project and how it aims at addressing this housing crisis more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. The 1 in 10 initiative is really just a call to the Australian government to recognise that it has a fundamental responsibility to make sure that its citizens can access decent quality housing. We think that they should be providing at least 10% of all new homes. As I mentioned a moment ago, that might sound like a radical idea in 2025, but it's nothing more than a return to what has been proven to work and worked for decades.
Okay, so why is it critical for the government to act now in tackling Australia's housing crisis, especially for essential workers? Seems like an obvious question, but yet here we are having the conversation.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, the reality is that housing is just one of those things, a bit like education, a bit like healthcare, which are expensive but essential, and which a large portion of the population is not going to be able to afford unless the government is providing a big chunk of the supply. I mean, I think deep down, we all understand that if we had a completely private education system, then there's a lot of people that wouldn't be able to afford to send their kids to school. And if we had a completely private healthcare system, tons of people wouldn't be able to afford to see a doctor. Well, right now, we've got an almost completely private housing supply system, even though that means millions of people can't afford a decent place to live. And that doesn't make any sense, and it really needs to change.
Yeah, there's an absolute disconnect there. So what are the key factors driving Australia's housing crisis at the moment? What are the sort of major pain points, if you will?
Well, look, there's a range of factors contributing to it. That's sort of the $64,000 question, and depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. Some people will tell you that it's all about sort of negative gearing and tax breaks for investors, and some people will tell you it's all about migration, and some people will tell you there's too much red tape and all of those things. The thing that never really seems to get a look in, or doesn't get much of a mention, is that once upon a time, the government built tons of housing, and now it builds almost none. And that's something that, can be addressed in a fairly straightforward manner. We really do need to sort of avoid all this unnecessary complexity and just get back to basics and what's been proven to work.
So how have rising rents impacted low and of course middle income families across the country, if we can take our attention to them for a minute?
Absolutely. Well, one of the consequences of a sort of failure to invest in social and affordable housing over a prolonged period, at the same time as house prices have kind of gone to the moon, is that you've got people tumbling into the rental market at both ends, if I can put it that way. So vacancy rates have become extremely tight. You've got sort of inward migration putting additional pressure on that. And you end up in this sort of housing Hunger Games situation. We've all seen the ridiculous scenes of sort of hundreds of people queuing up around the block to view a 2-bedroom apartment somewhere. So on people, including people on quite decent incomes, has been really profound.
So what role should the federal and of course state governments play in fixing the housing crisis, or at least adjusting the situation we're in some form, easing that pressure?
Yeah, look, none of this stuff is really rocket science.
No.
When governments in the past wanted to increase housing supply and make sure that low and middle income people had access to decent housing, they didn't look to the private sector. They understood that they had to get busy building housing and making it available at prices that people could actually afford. Markets are great at all kinds of things, but providing housing for people on low to moderate incomes is not one of them.
Okay, so is it safe to say increasing housing supply being the only solution, or are there other policies that perhaps need to change as well, flow-on effects, if you will?
It's not just a case of housing in general. It's what we really need is not more private sector supply. We need housing that's coming into the market at a price that regular people can afford. One of the interesting things is if you look into the data, the actual number of additional homes being built per 1,000 extra population, it's not that different to what it was sort of 30, 40 years ago. What has changed fundamentally is the proportion of that new supply, which is being provided by the government and is social housing, which by definition is something that's being provided at a below market price that people on lower incomes can actually afford. That's the piece that's really missing from the market. Of course, we want to see extra supply at all parts of the continuum, because that's one of the things. What happens in one part of the market has flow-on impacts elsewhere. But the biggest missing piece of the puzzle at the moment is that government-provided section, the bit that is affordable to people on low to moderate incomes, and the bit that hasn't been provided at scale for sort of going on 30 years now. That's where we really need to be focusing our attention, because at the end of the day, if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to very rapidly end up living in a version of Australia that would be inconceivable even 10 years ago. When having a full-time job is no guarantee of not ending up homeless, then something needs to change pretty rapidly.
Yeah, very well said by you. Martin, I want to thank you for joining us on the program. Is there anything you wanted to leave us with just to round out our discussion for now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we would love for people to help us make some noise about this. We've got a federal budget coming up in a couple of weeks' time. There's an election, not too long after that. There has really never been a better time for people to contact their local member of parliament and say that this is an issue that matters to you. People can do that by visiting the campaign website. You just need to go to homeinplace.org, click on the banner there, and the rest of it's all pretty straightforward after that. Go to the campaign website, use the embedded form there to email your local member, let them know that this matters to you, because election after election seems to come and go, and the housing policy that we see from the major parties in particular tends to be just gimmicks and window dressing. Let's see if we can make sure that this time it's different.
Yeah, put some things into action. Martin, again, thank you so much for joining us right here on Ticker. Hopefully we get to speak again as this continues to unfold.
Good to be with you.